The first time I heard her crying through the thin apartment wall, I thought it was just another ordinary night in a building full of strangers. But the sound didn't stop. It was the kind of quiet, broken crying that made the air feel heavy, the kind that made you wonder if someone was carrying more pain than the world could see. And that night, without knowing it, a simple favor for a neighbor would change my life in ways I never expected. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can change lives and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in compassion, and subscribe to the channel Touch of Kindness. Your support helps more stories like this reach people who need them. My name is Arman Qureshi, and 3 months ago I moved into a small apartment building on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a modest place with aging staircases, faded walls, and the distant sounds of traffic drifting in during the afternoons. But after years of working non-stop as a freelance carpenter, I had finally found a peaceful routine. Every morning sunlight poured through my kitchen window, and every afternoon the building fell into a calm silence that made the world feel slower. Across the hallway from my apartment lived a woman I barely noticed at first. Her name, I later learned, was Saira Malik. She was the kind of person who moved quietly through the hallways, carrying grocery bags or small packages, always with her head slightly lowered like she didn't want to disturb anyone. She had soft brown hair tied loosely behind her neck and gentle eyes that looked tired even in the daylight. We exchanged polite nods sometimes. Nothing more. Then one afternoon, everything changed. It was a warm, bright day. Sunlight filled the stairwell as I carried my toolbox back from a job. Just as I reached my door, I saw Saira struggling with a large cardboard box near her apartment. The box was almost as tall as the small table beside her door, and she was clearly having trouble moving it. I didn't think twice. I walked over and offered to help. She looked surprised, almost startled, but then nodded with quiet relief. Together we carried the heavy box inside her apartment. The place was simple but neat, filled with sunlight streaming through wide windows. A small plant sat on the windowsill, and the faint smell of fresh laundry floated through the room. It was the first time I saw the faint smile on her face. She thanked me softly, and before I left, she asked if I could help her fix a loose shelf in the kitchen. It took less than 10 minutes, just a few screws and a quick adjustment. A simple favor. But as I finished and prepared to leave, she said something that lingered in my mind long after I returned to my apartment. She looked at the repaired shelf, then at me, and quietly said, "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Her voice carried a kind of gratitude that felt deeper than the situation required. Over the next few weeks, small moments like that kept happening. Sometimes she would ask if I could help move a chair. Other times it was fixing a loose cabinet hinge or reaching something high on a shelf. They were tiny favors, the kind neighbors often do without thinking. But something about Saira always felt different. She spoke gently, but there was a quiet sadness behind her eyes. One afternoon, while helping her adjust the curtain rod near her living room window, I noticed framed photos on a nearby table. One photo showed Saira smiling brightly beside a man in a hospital uniform. Another photo showed her standing beside a little boy with curly hair and bright eyes. The boy couldn't have been older than 5. But the apartment was silent. No toys on the floor. No laughter in the rooms. Just quiet. That same evening, as sunlight faded across the hallway, I heard the crying again. Soft at first. Then heavier. The kind of crying someone tries desperately to hide. I stood near my door for several seconds, unsure if I should knock. Part of me felt it wasn't my place. We were neighbors, nothing more. But another part of me remembered the photos. Before I could change my mind, I knocked gently. The crying stopped almost immediately. A moment later, the door opened slowly. Saira stood there with red eyes and a forced smile. She tried to pretend everything was fine. But pain has a way of revealing itself no matter how hard someone tries to hide it. She apologized quietly, saying she must have made too much noise. I told her she didn't need to apologize. I simply asked if she was okay. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she stepped aside and let me in. Sunlight from the late afternoon filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room. She sat down on the couch while I remained near the doorway, unsure how much space she needed. Finally, after a long silence, she began to speak. Her husband had been a doctor. 2 years earlier, he had passed away suddenly after a heart condition no one knew about. The little boy in the photo, her son, Ryan, had fallen ill months later. A rare illness that took him before his 6th birthday. The words came slowly, like each one carried a weight too heavy to release. Her apartment, once filled with laughter, had become a quiet reminder of everything she had lost. She tried to stay strong during the day. But nights were the hardest. I didn't know what to say. Sometimes words feel small in the face of someone else's grief. So I simply stayed. We sat quietly while the last light of the afternoon faded through the windows. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. And just before I stepped out, she said the words that changed everything. She looked at me with tired eyes and said softly, "Would you stay a little longer next time?" It wasn't a romantic request. It wasn't even hopeful. It was simply the voice of someone who didn't want to feel alone anymore. From that day forward, something began to change. I started stopping by in the afternoons after work. Sometimes we drank tea near the window while sunlight warmed the room. Other times we just talked about ordinary things, books, childhood memories, favorite foods. Slowly, the apartment started to feel less silent. One afternoon, I brought a small wooden birdhouse I had carved during a quiet evening. Saira placed it on the windowsill beside her plant. She smiled in a way I had never seen before. Not forced. Not fragile. Real. Weeks turned into months. The sadness in her eyes didn't disappear completely, but it softened. She began opening the windows more often. Sometimes music played quietly in the background. One bright morning, I saw her kneeling on the small balcony, planting flowers in clay pots. Color slowly returned to her life. And in a strange way, it returned to mine too. Because somewhere between fixing shelves, sharing tea, and watching the sunlight cross her living room floor, I realized something unexpected. Kindness had quietly built a bridge between two strangers. Not through grand gestures. Just small moments. Small favors. Small acts of being there. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after that first knock on her door, Saira handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was taken from her apartment window. The picture showed me standing on the balcony fixing a loose railing while sunlight poured over the building. On the back of the photo she had written a short sentence. "You reminded me that life still has light." I looked up and saw tears in her eyes again. But this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were something else. Hope. Before this story comes to an end, we have a small request for you. If this moment touched your heart, please write the word kindness in the comments. Sometimes a single word can remind the world that compassion still exists. Because the truth is, none of us know what battles the people around us are fighting. Sometimes the person living behind the next door is carrying a silence heavier than we can imagine. And sometimes all it takes to begin healing is someone willing to stay a little longer. Months later, the apartment building felt different. The once quiet hallway now carried the scent of fresh flowers from Saira's balcony. Laughter occasionally echoed through her apartment when her sister visited with her children.